The heart monitor's steady beeping fills the sterile hospital room as I lie here, my body broken from what everyone believes was a tragic accident. Though I know better now, I know the truth about the brake lines that mysteriously failed on the winding mountain road where I'd driven so many times before. And as the morphine clouds my vision, I can see them all gathered around my bedside, like vultures waiting for the feast. My adoptive family, the people who raised me after my parents died when I was 8, the people I've spent 20 years trying to prove myself worthy of loving. Margaret Chen Morrison, my stepmother, dabs at her eyes with a silk handkerchief that costs more than most people's monthly salary, whispering to the nurse about how devastating this is for the family, how I'd always been so reckless with my health, working myself to exhaustion, building my little consulting business instead of taking better care of myself like a proper daughter should. Beside her, my stepsister Vivian scrolls through her phone, occasionally glancing up to perform grief for any medical staff who might be watching. Her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the designer purse I bought her for Christmas, while my stepbrother Marcus paces by the window, checking his watch like he has somewhere more important to be than his dying sister's bedside. The lawyer is here, Marcus announces, and I watch through half-closed eyes as a thin man in an expensive suit enters, carrying documents that will seal my fate, papers I signed just last week when Margaret convinced me that consolidating the family assets would be more efficient for tax purposes, when she told me with tears in her eyes that she just wanted to take care of me the way my real parents would have wanted. The will reading feels surreal, listening to my own life being divided up like pieces of a pie. Everything I've worked for going to these people who have spent decades telling me how grateful I should be for their charity, how lucky I was that they took in a poor orphaned girl out of the goodness of their hearts. To my beloved family, the lawyer reads in a monotone voice, who gave me love and support when I had nothing, I leave everything I own with the hope that they will use it to build the happy life they deserve. I want to laugh at the bitter irony of those words I wrote in what I thought was gratitude, because now I understand exactly what kind of happy life they've been planning. Now I know why Margaret has been so insistent on managing my finances, why Marcus suddenly needed so many business loans, why Vivian's credit card bills kept mysteriously appearing in my mail, why David Park, my handsome fiancé who claimed to love me for my beautiful soul, started pushing for a quick wedding right after I signed those asset transfer documents. The truth crashes over me like ice water as Margaret squeezes my hand and whispers, "Don't worry, darling. We'll take such good care of everything you've built. Your little business will be in safe hands with family." My little business, if only they knew that my little consulting business was actually a carefully constructed facade hiding the fact that I am Sophia Chen, the anonymous founder and CEO of Softtech Industries, the artificial intelligence company that's about to revolutionize medical diagnostics, the same Sophia Chen who owns Phoenix Properties, one of the largest luxury real estate portfolios in the country, the same Sophia Chen whose venture capital firm has quietly funded half the most successful startups in Silicon Valley over the past 5 years. $50 billion, that's what I'm worth. $50 billion in cryptocurrency, tech patents, real estate, and strategic investments that I've hidden behind shell companies and false names because I was terrified that if my family knew the truth about my wealth, they would stop loving me for who I am and start loving me for what I could give them. But the joke is on me because they never loved me at all. They just saw me as their personal ATM, their retirement plan, their ticket to the lifestyle they believed they deserved, simply for tolerating my presence in their perfect family. As the morphine pulls me deeper into darkness, I think about all the signs I ignored, all the red flags I explained away because I was so desperate to belong somewhere. So grateful to have a family that I convinced myself their constant financial emergencies were just bad luck. Their subtle insults were just concern for my well-being. Their increasing control over my life was just love, expressed badly. I remember overhearing Margaret on the phone 6 months ago, talking to someone about the inheritance situation and making sure everything transfers smoothly when the time comes, and how, when I asked her about it, she laughed and said she was just planning a surprise party for my birthday. And I believed her because I wanted to believe her, because the alternative was too painful to consider. The machines start beeping faster now, and I can hear Margaret's fake sobs getting louder for the benefit of the medical staff. Vivian practicing her grieving sister performance. Marcus checking his watch again like my death is just another appointment on his busy schedule. And as my vision fades to black, I have one final crystal clear thought. If I had another chance, if I could do it all over again, I would never hide my power. I would never apologize for my success. I would never let anyone make me feel guilty for having more than they do. And I would sure as hell never let these gold-digging parasites drain me dry while calling it love. But before the darkness takes me completely, my mind drifts back to how it all began. To the day I turned 18 and met with my parents' lawyer to discuss the life insurance policy they'd left me, expecting maybe enough to pay for college and a modest apartment, but instead discovering that my brilliant scientist parents had been far more financially savvy than anyone realized, that their modest life insurance was actually a cover for cryptocurrency investments they'd made in the early days of Bitcoin, tech patents they'd filed and sold to major corporations, and a trust fund that had been quietly growing for 10 years while I lived on the charity of people who thought I was practically penniless. The lawyer, Mr. Harrison, had looked at me with something like pity when he explained that my adoptive family had been receiving monthly payments for my care. Payments that were supposed to stop when I turned 18, but that they had somehow convinced him to continue under the guise of educational support. And it was only when I pressed him for details that I learned they'd been taking nearly $50,000 a month for my expenses while feeding me generic cereal for breakfast and making me wear Vivian's hand-me-down clothes. That day, I made two decisions that would shape the next 7 years of my life. First, I would never let the Chen Morrison family know about my real inheritance. And second, I would use that money to build something so massive, so successful, that I would never have to depend on anyone for anything ever again. I started small, investing in cryptocurrency when it was still considered a joke, buying up patents from bankrupt tech companies, purchasing distressed real estate in neighborhoods that I researched obsessively until I could predict which ones would gentrify next. Softech Industries began as a dormitory project when I was studying computer science, working 18-hour days to develop artificial intelligence algorithms that could diagnose medical conditions faster and more accurately than human doctors. And while my family thought I was just playing with computers, I was actually filing patents that would eventually be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I incorporated under my middle name using a completely different address, hiring lawyers and accountants who specialized in maintaining client anonymity, creating a web of shell companies so complex that even the most dedicated investigator would need months to trace everything back to me. Phoenix Properties started with a single abandoned warehouse in what everyone said was a bad neighborhood, but I had studied the city development plans. I knew about the light rail expansion and the tech campus that was planned for the area, so I bought building after building, renovating them into luxury condos and commercial spaces that I rented to the same tech companies I was investing in through Chen Ventures, my private equity firm that specialized in backing startups, run by brilliant founders who reminded me of my younger self. Hungry, determined, and vastly underestimated by everyone around them. For 7 years, I lived this double life, driving to family dinners in my beat-up Honda Civic while my Bugatti sat in a garage across town, shopping at discount stores for the groceries I'd cook for Sunday meals while my personal chef prepared meals for my real life. The life I lived in a penthouse they didn't know I owned, wearing designer clothes they'd never seen, attending board meetings for companies they'd never heard of. The irony was delicious and heartbreaking in equal measure. Marcus would complain about his startup failing to get investors, while I had actually been funding his competitors through my venture capital firm. Vivian would cry about not being able to afford acting classes, while I was unknowingly bankrolling the theater company that kept rejecting her auditions. Margaret would stress about her medical spa's financial troubles, while I was one of the silent investors keeping it afloat, and all the while, they treated me like their charity case, their financial burden, the grateful orphan who should be thankful for every scrap of attention they threw my way. But the burden of hiding my success became heavier every year, watching them struggle with problems that I could solve with a single phone call, biting my tongue when they made snide comments about my lack of ambition, pretending to be grateful when they offered to help me manage my finances better, all while knowing that my net worth was growing by millions every month, that I was being invited to economic summits and technology conferences, that world leaders and business moguls sought my advice on artificial intelligence and sustainable development. The hardest part was watching them manipulate me with fake love, seeing Margaret's tears when she talked about how worried she was about my small income, feeling Marcus's patronizing hand on my shoulder when he offered to teach me about real business, listening to Vivian's concerned speeches about how I needed to stop being so generous and start thinking about my own future, all while they were systematically bleeding me dry of the money they thought I had, never realizing that every dollar they took was a tiny fraction of what I could have given them freely if they had simply loved me without agenda. The cryptocurrency alone would have been enough to set them up for life. I'd gotten in early enough that my parents' modest investment had multiplied 10,000-fold, but I'd continued buying and mining, building a portfolio that fluctuated between $8 and $12 billion depending on market conditions. The tech patents were worth another $15 billion, licensing deals with every major corporation that wanted to use artificial intelligence in their products. The real estate holdings were approaching $20 billion, as urban development followed exactly the patterns I'd predicted. And the venture capital investments were generating returns that even I found shocking sometimes. $50 billion in total, growing every day, and I was living like a struggling graduate student because I was terrified that if my family knew the truth, they would stop pretending to love me and start openly treating me like what I apparently was to them anyway, a walking, talking bank account that happened to share their last name. But as my body fails me here in this hospital bed, I finally understand that they figured out my secret long ago, and the real tragedy isn't that they never loved me. It's that I was right to hide my wealth because they had been planning to take it all along, planning not just to drain me financially, but to eliminate me entirely once they had secured legal access to everything I'd built. The memory that breaks my heart the most is from 6 months ago, when I came home early from a business trip and overheard Margaret on the phone in her office, talking to someone in a voice I'd never heard her use before, cold and calculating and completely devoid of the maternal warmth she always performed for my benefit. "The investigation is finally complete," she was saying. "And you were right, she's worth far more than we ever imagined. But she's hidden it so cleverly that we'll need to be strategic about how we proceed with the asset recovery." Asset recovery, like my life's work, was stolen property that needed to be returned to its rightful owners. Like the empire I'd built through sleepless nights and brilliant innovations and calculated risks somehow belonged to them simply because they'd provided me with a roof over my head and 3 meals a day for 10 years. "The engagement to David is perfect timing," Margaret continued, and I pressed myself against the wall outside her office, my heart pounding as I realized that my romance, my fairy tale love story with the charming lawyer who swept me off my feet with poetry and flowers and talk of building a future together, was actually just another layer of their elaborate con game. Once they're married, he'll have access to everything, and then we can begin the systematic transfer process without raising any suspicions. David Park, my handsome fiancé who claimed to love my beautiful soul and kind heart, who said he wanted to take care of me forever and protect me from the cruel world, was actually a co-conspirator in what amounted to the most sophisticated financial murder I'd ever encountered. The romantic dinners where he urged me to trust him completely with my finances, the sweet conversations about combining our assets for efficiency, the gentle pressure to sign power of attorney documents, just in case something happened to me. All of it had been carefully orchestrated to give him legal access to accounts and investments that he and my family believed represented my entire fortune. "What about the companies?" the voice on the other end of the phone asked, and Margaret's laugh was bitter and sharp. "That's the beautiful part. She's been so paranoid about keeping everything secret that there are no obvious connections between her and her business interests. David will have access to her known accounts, which should be enough to keep us comfortable, and the rest will just disappear into legal limbo when she's gone." Legal limbo. They were planning my death, planning it as casually as they might plan a vacation. And they were so confident in their scheme that they didn't even bother to lower their voices when discussing how to dispose of my body after the accident they were arranging. The staged business failures began shortly after that phone call, starting with my consulting business, the small legitimate company I used as a front for my real activities. Suddenly, clients were canceling contracts. Vendors were demanding immediate payment for services I'd never ordered. Tax investigators were auditing books that had been perfectly clean for years. Margaret offered to help, of course, sighing about how overwhelming business ownership must be for someone with my limited experience, suggesting that perhaps it would be better to consolidate everything under family management until I got back on my feet. Marcus played his part perfectly, approaching me with increasingly desperate requests for loans, claiming that his own business was failing due to market conditions and that he needed just a little help to stay afloat until things turned around. "You're so good with money, Soph," he would say, using the childhood nickname that always made me feel like I belonged somewhere. "And we're family, we help each other out, right?" Vivian's contribution was more subtle but equally effective. A constant stream of emotional manipulation designed to make me feel guilty for having any financial security at all, while my poor sister struggled to make ends meet in her expensive pursuit of an acting career that everyone knew was doomed to failure. "I just wish I had your luck," she would sigh, looking around my modest apartment with what I thought was envy but now realize was calculation. "Getting all that life insurance money while the rest of us have to work for everything we have." And David, sweet manipulative David, slowly increasing his pressure for me to streamline my financial arrangements, suggesting that as my future husband, he should be more involved in managing our household expenses, offering to take some of the burden off my shoulders by handling the tedious details of bill paying and investment monitoring that I claim to find so stressful. The final insult was the prenuptial agreement he presented to me just 2 weeks before our planned wedding, a document that looked protective on the surface, but that I now understand was designed to give him immediate access to everything I owned while protecting none of my interests in return. "It's just a formality," he assured me, his handsome face radiating sincerity. "Something to make the lawyers happy so we can focus on building our life together." The car accident that brought me here was the culmination of months of planning, I realize now, staged to look like the result of my own reckless driving on a road I traveled frequently, on a night when I was supposedly driving alone to a business meeting that David had encouraged me to attend, in a car that Marcus had offered to service for me the day before, because he was worried about my safety. They orchestrated everything so perfectly, from the financial pressure that was supposed to make me desperate enough to sign away my autonomy, to the romantic manipulation that was supposed to make me eager to merge my assets with David's, to the systematic isolation that left me with no one to turn to when things started falling apart except the very people who were engineering my destruction. As consciousness fades from my broken body, I think about all the signs I missed, all the moments when I could have seen through their performance if I hadn't been so desperate to believe that someone, somewhere, actually loved me for who I was, rather than what I could provide for them. I think about my real parents, brilliant scientists who died in a laboratory accident when I was 8 years old, who left me not just money, but a legacy of innovation and integrity that I've spent my adult life trying to honor through my work in artificial intelligence and sustainable technology. They would be horrified to know that their daughter died at the hands of people who saw her grief and vulnerability as opportunities for financial gain, that the family they entrusted with my care saw me as nothing more than a long-term investment that was finally ready to pay dividends. Margaret's sobs grow louder as my vital signs weaken, and I hear her whispering to the nurse about funeral arrangements, about how she wants something simple and dignified for her beloved stepdaughter, something that won't be too expensive because Sophia would have wanted us to be practical about these things. Even in death, they're still managing my money, still making decisions based on what benefits them rather than what honors my memory. Vivian's voice drifts over the sound of the machines. Should I call her business associates? Let them know about the accident? But I know she's not thinking about notifying my colleagues. She's thinking about contacting the people who might know about my real wealth, trying to identify assets and accounts that David might have missed in his research, making sure that every possible dollar finds its way into their greedy hands. Marcus is already on his phone, probably talking to the gambling contacts who've been threatening him for months, assuring them that his big score is finally paying off, that he'll have their money plus interest within a matter of days once the estate paperwork is processed. And David, who proposed to me on a beach in Malibu with a ring I later realized I had unknowingly paid for through one of his consulting fees. David, who whispered promises about growing old together while secretly calculating how quickly he could liquidate my assets. David is nowhere to be seen, probably meeting with lawyers to ensure that the marriage documents he forged will hold up under legal scrutiny. My last conscious thought is a moment of perfect clarity. I gave them everything because I thought love could be bought with gratitude, because I believed that if I was just generous enough, selfless enough, grateful enough, they would eventually see me as worthy of the genuine affection I craved so desperately. But they never saw me as a person at all. I was always just a resource to be exploited, a problem to be solved, an obstacle standing between them and the lifestyle they believed they deserved. I was never their daughter. I was their retirement plan. And the tragedy isn't that they never loved me. It's that I spent so many years hiding my light under a bushel because I was afraid that shining too brightly would drive away the only family I had, never realizing that they had been planning to extinguish that light permanently the moment it became inconvenient for them. The heart monitor flatlines with a sound like finality itself, and in that moment between life and death, I feel something I haven't experienced in 20 years. Complete and total freedom from the burden of gratitude, from the weight of trying to earn love from people who are incapable of giving it, from the exhausting performance of being less than I am so that others can feel better about themselves. If I had another chance, I think as the darkness closes in, I would never hide my power again. I would never apologize for my success. I would never let anyone make me feel guilty for having more than they do, and I would sure as hell never let these gold-digging parasites drain me dry while calling it love. Then I opened my eyes and realized I had been reborn. The sunlight streaming through my bedroom window is all wrong. Too bright, too cheerful, coming from the wrong angle entirely. And as I sit up in bed, my heart pounding with residual terror from what must have been the most vivid nightmare of my life, I realize that everything around me looks exactly the way it did 6 months ago, before the business trouble started, before David's increasing financial pressure, before the systematic destruction of everything I thought I could trust. My phone buzzes insistently on the nightstand, and when I pick it up, I see 17 missed calls from David Park, 3 voicemails from Margaret, and a text from Marcus that makes my blood run cold. Sis, can you loan me another $100K? Amazing investment opportunity, need to move fast. Family discount, I'll pay you back with interest, promise. The date on my phone screen reads March 15th. Exactly 6 months before my death, exactly the day when I was supposed to sign the first asset transfer document that Margaret had been pressuring me about for weeks. At exactly the moment when I handed over the first piece of my financial independence to people who were already planning my murder. But this time, I remember everything. I remember the staged business failures, the romantic manipulation, the systematic isolation, the casual conversations about asset recovery and disposal methods that my family thought I would never overhear. I remember the feeling of my life draining away in that hospital bed while they performed grief for the medical staff and planned my cheap funeral. And most importantly, I remember the crystal clear realization that I spent years hiding my wealth from people who never loved me anyway. Margaret's voice echoes through the apartment as she lets herself in with the key I foolishly gave her years ago, calling out in that sickeningly sweet tone she uses when she wants something. Sophia, darling, I brought coffee and croissants from that lovely bakery you like, and I thought we could have a little chat about those financial documents we discussed. But instead of the grateful eagerness she's expecting, instead of the anxious compliance that characterized every previous interaction we've had about money, I feel something I haven't experienced in decades, the cold, clear certainty of someone who has absolutely nothing left to lose. Actually, Margaret, I call back, my voice steady and professional, in a way that makes her footsteps pause in the hallway. I've been reviewing my finances, and I think I've been far too generous with family loans that never seem to get repaid. The silence that follows is profound, and I can practically hear the wheels turning in her head as she tries to process this completely unexpected response from the stepdaughter who has never, in 20 years of manipulation, questioned her financial authority or expressed anything but gratitude for her guidance. When she appears in my bedroom doorway, perfectly coiffed and carrying a pastry bag that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, her smile is just a little too bright, her concern just a little too performative. Darling, you seem different this morning. Are you feeling quite well? You sound so businesslike. And for the first time in my adult life, I look directly into Margaret Chen Morrison's eyes and see her exactly as she is. Not the loving stepmother who rescued a poor orphan out of the goodness of her heart, but a cold-blooded financial predator who has spent 2 decades positioning herself to steal everything I've worked to build. I'm feeling clear-headed for the first time in years, I reply, and the truth of that statement settles around me like armor. clear-headed enough to start asking some important questions about where my money has been going and why my family seems to have so many financial emergencies that somehow never get resolved despite my constant assistance. Margaret's composure cracks just slightly, a micro expression of panic that she covers quickly with a concerned frown. Sophia, sweetheart, I hope you're not suggesting that we've been anything but grateful for your help or that we would ever take advantage of your generous nature. But I'm done being managed, done being manipulated, done allowing these people to gaslight me into believing that their financial parasitism is somehow evidence of my own virtue. Actually, Margaret, that's exactly what I'm suggesting. And I think it's time we had an honest conversation about the nature of our relationship. The pastry bag drops from her hand as she realizes that something fundamental has shifted, that the grateful, compliant girl she's been systematically draining for 20 years has somehow disappeared overnight, replaced by someone who sounds suspiciously like the kind of person who might actually be capable of building a multi-billion-dollar business empire. David's arrival 20 minutes later is so perfectly timed that I have to admire the coordination involved. Clearly, Margaret called him the moment she realized that her usual manipulation tactics weren't working, that her beloved stepdaughter was suddenly asking uncomfortable questions about money and demanding actual accountability for years of family loans that were never intended to be repaid. He sweeps into my apartment with his characteristic charm, flowers in one hand and that devastating smile that once made my heart race. But now I can see the calculation behind his performance, the way his eyes immediately scan my modest living space for any signs of the wealth he's been so desperate to access. Darling, he says, approaching me with the kind of cautious movements you might use with a skittish animal. Margaret mentioned that you're feeling a bit overwhelmed this morning, and I thought perhaps we could talk about streamlining some of those financial concerns that have been weighing on you. 6 months ago, this speech would have filled me with gratitude and relief. Here was my handsome, successful fiancé, offering to take care of the boring details of money management so that I could focus on more important things like planning our wedding and building our future together. But now I can hear the predatory undertone, the assumption that I'm too stupid or too emotional to handle my own affairs. The subtle pressure to hand over control of assets he believes represent my entire net worth. Actually, David, I say, settling into the armchair that gives me the best view of both him and Margaret, who has been hovering in the doorway like a vulture waiting for her chance to swoop in. I've been thinking about our conversation last week, about combining our finances and streamlining our investments, and I have some questions. His smile falters just slightly, but he recovers quickly, moving to sit on the couch in a way that's calculated to seem casual, but actually positions him to invade my personal space if necessary. Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind? Well, I begin, enjoying the way both he and Margaret lean forward slightly, expecting me to express gratitude for their willingness to manage my financial affairs. I'm curious about the specific mechanisms you have in mind for this streamlining process and what kind of oversight and accountability measures we'll put in place to ensure that both of our interests are protected. The silence that follows is delicious because neither of them expected me to approach this conversation like the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, which of course is exactly what I am, even if they don't know it yet. David's recovery is smooth and professional, but I can see the wheels turning behind his eyes as he tries to figure out why his usual emotional manipulation isn't working, why I'm suddenly talking like someone who actually understands financial management rather than someone who needs to be protected from her own incompetence. Well, naturally, we would want to ensure that everything is handled properly, he says, his tone just a little too measured. But I think the most important thing is trust, don't you? When two people love each other the way we do, the specific details matter less than the commitment to building a life together. Trust, the weapon they've been using against me for 20 years, the emotional bludgeon designed to make me feel guilty for asking reasonable questions about my own money. But this time, instead of melting under the pressure of his disappointed expression, I feel something I've never experienced before in a conversation with my family. Complete and utter emotional detachment. Trust is certainly important, I agree, but so is transparency and accountability and mutual respect for each other's financial autonomy. I've been thinking that perhaps we should each maintain separate accounts for our individual assets and only combine resources for specific shared expenses like housing and vacation planning. Margaret makes a sound like a strangled gasp, and David's charm cracks just enough for me to see the flash of anger underneath. This is not how this conversation was supposed to go. I was supposed to be grateful and compliant, eager to hand over control of my finances to the strong, capable man who was willing to take care of me despite my obvious inadequacies in practical matters. Sophia, David says, and his voice carries just a hint of the patronizing tone he usually reserves for private conversations. I think you might be overthinking this. Financial management can be quite complex, and I have experience with investment strategies that might be unfamiliar to you. And there it is, the assumption that I'm too stupid to manage my own money. The condescending certainty that his superior knowledge and experience give him the right to make decisions about assets I've worked 20 years to accumulate. If he only knew that my investment strategies have outperformed the market by 30% annually for the past 5 years, that my artificial intelligence algorithms are revolutionizing entire industries, that my real estate portfolio alone is worth more than his entire extended family will earn in their lifetimes. But instead of revealing my true net worth, instead of crushing him with the reality of my financial sophistication, I make a different strategic choice. I'm going to let them reveal their true nature to the world slowly and publicly and irreversibly while I gradually stop hiding the wealth they've been so desperate to steal. You know what, David? I say, standing up in a way that signals the end of this conversation. I think you're absolutely right that financial matters can be complex, which is why I've decided to take a much more hands-on approach to managing my own affairs. I'll be reviewing all of my investments and expenditures over the next few months, and I think it would be best if we postponed any major financial decisions until I have a clearer picture of my overall situation. The look that passes between David and Margaret is brief but unmistakable. Pure panic, barely controlled, as they realize that their carefully orchestrated timeline for gaining access to my assets has just been completely derailed by my unexpected display of financial independence. This time, I won't hide my power, I won't apologize for my success, and I won't let anyone make me feel guilty for having more than they think I deserve. This time, I'm going to watch their faces turn to ash as they realize exactly what they've lost through their own greed and betrayal. The game has officially begun. The first move in my carefully orchestrated revenge strategy is so subtle that none of them notice it initially. I simply stop providing the financial support that has been propping up their lifestyles for years, letting them believe that my recent business troubles have made me more cautious about money, rather than revealing that I'm systematically cutting off the flow of resources they've come to see as their birthright. Marcus's startup is the first to feel the effects when the anonymous investor, who has been funding his company, me, operating through one of my shell corporations, suddenly withdraws support, citing concerns about market viability and leadership competence. He calls me 3 days later, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, claiming that he needs an emergency loan to keep his business afloat just until he can secure new funding. I don't understand what happened, Soph, he says, using that childhood nickname that once made me feel like I belong somewhere, but now sounds like manipulation. The investor just pulled out without any explanation, said something about reassessing their portfolio priorities. If only he knew that the investor's reassessment involved realizing that his business model was fundamentally flawed, his management style was toxic, and his primary qualification for running a tech company seemed to be his ability to charm money out of his sister while producing absolutely nothing of value in return. That's terrible, Marcus, I reply, injecting just the right amount of sympathy into my voice. But I'm afraid my own financial situation has become quite precarious lately, so I'm not in a position to provide any additional loans until I get my own house in order. The silence that follows is profound, because in 20 years of asking me for money, Marcus has never once been told no, has never once been forced to consider the possibility that his sister might not be an unlimited source of financial resources for his increasingly desperate schemes. Vivian's crisis comes 2 weeks later when her credit cards are mysteriously maxed out and the bank account she's been using for her acting career expenses is suddenly frozen due to irregular activity. Irregular activity that I may have triggered by having my financial team flag several suspicious transactions that technically qualify as potential fraud. Sophia, I don't know what to do, she sobs during her tearful phone call. Someone has stolen my identity and destroyed my credit, and I can't afford my acting coach or my headshots or even my rent until this gets sorted out. The beautiful irony is that no one has stolen her identity. I've simply stopped funding the lifestyle she believed she was entitled to as my poor, struggling sister. And without my anonymous subsidies, the reality of her financial situation has become unavoidably clear. Have you considered getting a regular job while you sort out these credit issues? I suggest gently, knowing that the idea of actual employment, work that involves showing up somewhere every day and performing tasks in exchange for a paycheck, has never occurred to someone who has spent her entire adult life living off family money while pursuing a dream that everyone except her knows will never materialize. But the most satisfying reaction comes from Margaret when her precious medical spa suddenly can't pay its suppliers because the silent investor who has been covering its operating expenses, again, me, operating through a different shell company, has unexpectedly withdrawn funding, citing concerns about regulatory compliance and operational oversight. She storms into my apartment without calling first, her usual maternal performance replaced by something much more honest and infinitely more ugly. Sophia, I need to know exactly what your financial situation is, because there are family obligations that need to be met, and if you're hiding assets while the rest of us struggle, that's not just selfish, it's unconscionable. Family obligations, the phrase that has been used to guilt me into funding their lifestyle for 2 decades. The emotional manipulation that transformed my gratitude for their care into a lifetime financial servitude that I was too grateful and too desperate for love to recognize. I'm not hiding anything, Margaret, I reply. And technically, this is true because I'm not hiding my assets anymore. I'm simply allowing my real financial situation to become visible gradually while they reveal their true nature to anyone who cares to watch. I'm just being more careful about my spending since my business has been experiencing some difficulties. What I don't mention is that my business difficulties are entirely fictional, that Softech Industries just signed a $100 million contract with a major hospital system, that Phoenix Properties acquired another $50 million worth of commercial real estate last month, and that my venture capital fund is about to announce its most successful quarter in company history. Instead, I watch her face cycle through confusion, anger, and something that looks suspiciously like fear as she realizes that the financial foundation supporting her entire family might not be as solid as she'd assumed, that the grateful orphan she's been systematically exploiting might not be as easily manipulated as she'd believed. "We need to have a family meeting," she announces, her voice carrying the kind of authority she's always used when she wants to pressure me into making financial decisions that benefit everyone except me. "Tonight, David will be there, and we're going to figure out how to resolve these problems together." But for the first time in my adult life, I look directly into Margaret Chen Morrison's eyes and feel absolutely no obligation to comply with her demands. No guilt about disappointing her expectations. No fear that refusing her will somehow prove that I'm ungrateful for everything she's done for me. "Actually, Margaret," I say, my voice calm and professional and completely devoid of the apology she's expecting, "I think I'll be spending this evening reviewing my financial records and making some important decisions about my future priorities. You're welcome to have your family meeting without me." The shock on her face is priceless because in 20 years of family meetings about my money, I have never once declined to attend, never once suggested that I might have priorities more important than managing their financial crises, never once acted like someone who had any right to make independent decisions about my own life. This is just the beginning. David's reaction to my newfound financial independence is more subtle than my family's panic, but infinitely more dangerous. Because unlike Marcus and Vivian and Margaret, he has legal training and actual intelligence, which makes him capable of sophisticated manipulation strategies that go far beyond simple emotional blackmail. He arrives at my apartment 3 days after the failed family meeting, carrying a bottle of expensive wine and wearing the kind of smile that once made my heart race, but now triggers every instinct I have for self-preservation. And I realize with crystal clarity that this is the moment when our relationship either transforms into something honest or reveals itself to be the elaborate financial scam I now know it was always intended to be. "Darling," he says, settling onto my couch with the kind of casual intimacy that suggests he still believes he has unlimited access to my emotional vulnerabilities. I've been thinking about our conversation the other day, about your concerns regarding financial transparency and accountability, and I want you to know that I completely support your desire to take a more active role in managing your assets. The speech is perfectly calibrated to sound supportive while actually containing no meaningful concessions, and I have to admire the skill involved in saying absolutely nothing while making it sound like a generous offer of cooperation. That's wonderful to hear, I reply, settling into the armchair that gives me the best view of his face while keeping me physically out of his reach. Because I've been doing some research into asset protection strategies, and I think it would be prudent for us to maintain completely separate financial portfolios until after we're married. His smile doesn't waver, but something shifts behind his eyes. A micro expression of irritation that he covers quickly with another perfectly performed display of understanding concern. Of course, sweetheart, whatever makes you feel most comfortable, he says. And then, because he can't help himself, he adds the line that reveals exactly how little he thinks of my intelligence. Though I hope you'll consider consulting with professionals who specialize in investment management, because some of these financial instruments can be quite complex for someone without extensive experience in portfolio optimization. Portfolio optimization. If he only knew that my extensive experience includes managing investments that have consistently outperformed every major market index for the past 5 years, that my artificial intelligence trading algorithms are so sophisticated that other investment firms have offered me billions of dollars just to license the technology. But instead of crushing him with the truth about my financial sophistication, I decide to let him hang himself with his own assumptions, to give him enough rope to reveal exactly what kind of man he really is when he thinks he's dealing with someone too naive to recognize his manipulation. Actually, David, I've been considering hiring an independent financial advisor to review all of my investments and expenditures, I say, watching his face carefully for any sign of panic. Someone with no connection to my family or personal relationships who can give me completely objective advice about how to protect and grow my assets. The silence that follows is profound, and I can practically see him calculating how quickly an independent financial advisor would discover the systematic drainage of my known accounts, how easily they would identify the patterns of manipulation that have characterized my family's financial relationship with me for decades. That's an interesting idea, he finally says, his voice just a little too controlled. But I wonder if you might be overthinking this, sweetheart. After all, when two people love each other the way we do, financial transparency should come naturally, shouldn't it? Love, the word he uses like a weapon, the emotional manipulation designed to make me feel guilty for protecting myself from people who have never had my best interests at heart. But this time, instead of melting under the pressure of his disappointed expression, I feel something I've never experienced in our relationship, complete and utter clarity about his motivations. You're absolutely right that love should involve transparency. I agree, which is why I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your financial situation, David. I realize that in all the time we've been together, I know almost nothing about your assets, your debts, your investment strategies, or your long-term financial goals. The look that crosses his face is brief but unmistakable. Pure panic. Quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough for me to miss it. Because, of course, David Park doesn't want to discuss his financial situation, doesn't want to reveal that his lifestyle is funded by debt and gambling, and increasingly desperate schemes to access other people's money. Well, naturally, I'm happy to discuss my finances with you, he says, but his voice carries the kind of reluctance that suggests he's hoping I'll drop the subject if he sounds enthusiastic enough about eventual transparency. But perhaps we should focus on your situation first, since you seem to be experiencing some uncertainty about your investment strategies. My investment strategies. If he only knew that my uncertainty is actually the cold, clear calculation of someone who has built a financial empire while he's been plotting to steal what he thinks is my modest inheritance. Actually, David, I say, standing up in a way that signals the end of this conversation. I think I'm more certain about my financial priorities than I've ever been in my life. I'm certain that I want complete independence and control over my assets. I'm certain that I want relationships based on emotional connection rather than economic opportunity. And I'm certain that anyone who truly loves me will support those priorities without question. The mask slips completely for just a moment, and I see exactly what David Park looks like when he's not performing charm for my benefit, cold, calculating, and absolutely furious that his carefully orchestrated seduction is being derailed by my unexpected display of financial sophistication. Sophia, he says, and his voice carries just a hint of the threat that I now realize was always lurking underneath his romantic performance. I hope you're not making decisions based on paranoia or fear rather than trust and love. Sometimes when people become too focused on protecting themselves, they end up destroying the very relationships that matter most to them. It's a beautifully crafted piece of emotional manipulation designed to make me feel guilty for protecting myself, to convince me that my instincts for self-preservation are actually character flaws that will drive away the man who loves me. But this time, instead of apologizing for my suspicions, instead of feeling guilty for questioning his motives, I look directly into David Park's eyes and see him exactly as he is. Not the loving fiancé who wants to protect me from the complexities of financial management, but a sophisticated predator who has spent months positioning himself to steal everything I've worked to build. You know what, David? I say, my voice calm and final. I think you're absolutely right that fear can be destructive to relationships, which is why I'm no longer going to be afraid of trusting my own judgment about what's best for my life and my future. The engagement ring comes off my finger with surprising ease, and as I place it on the coffee table between us, I realize that this moment feels nothing like heartbreak and everything like liberation. I think we want very different things from a marriage, I continue, and I think it's better for both of us if we acknowledge that incompatibility now rather than pretending we can build a future together on fundamentally different values. His recovery is swift and professional, but not swift enough to hide the flash of pure rage that crosses his face when he realizes that months of careful seduction have just been undone by my refusal to be the grateful, compliant victim he was expecting. Sophia, he says, standing up with the kind of controlled aggression that makes me grateful for the distance between us. I think you're making a mistake that you're going to regret for the rest of your life. And for the first time since I've known him, David Park sounds exactly like the kind of man who might tamper with someone's brake lines if they refuse to cooperate with his financial schemes. Perhaps, I reply, but it will be my mistake to make, and my life to live with the consequences. The door closes behind him with a sound like finality, and as I watch his figure disappear down the hallway, I realize that I've just taken the first real step toward freeing myself from 20 years of systematic manipulation and financial exploitation. Tomorrow, I think I'll start letting them see who I really am. Marcus's complete financial meltdown happens faster than even I anticipated, because without my anonymous support, his business collapses within 2 weeks, revealing itself to be nothing more than an elaborate shell game designed to funnel other people's money into his gambling debts and lifestyle maintenance. He shows up at my apartment at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, unshaven and wild-eyed, wearing the kind of expensive clothes that no legitimately struggling entrepreneur should be able to afford. And the moment I see his face, I know that whatever happens next is going to permanently shatter any remaining illusions about the nature of our family relationship. "Soph, thank God you're home," he says, pushing past me into my living room without waiting for an invitation. "I need to talk to you about a serious situation, and I need you to listen to me very carefully before you say anything." The desperation in his voice is so raw that for a moment I almost feel sorry for him, until I remember that his serious situation is the direct result of choices he made while believing that his sister would always be available to bail him out of the consequences of his own reckless behavior. "Of course, Marcus," I say, settling into my armchair while he paces back and forth like a caged animal. "What's going on?" "I owe some people money," he begins, and the careful way he phrases this tells me that we're about to discuss sums that go far beyond the $100,000 family loans he's been requesting for months. Serious money to serious people. And they've made it very clear that if I don't have their payment by the end of this week, there will be consequences that go beyond financial penalties. Physical threats. My stepbrother has gotten himself into debt with criminals, has apparently been using my reputation and our family connections as collateral for loans that he never had any realistic plan to repay. How much money are we talking about, Marcus? I ask, keeping my voice calm and professional, even as I'm calculating exactly how he's managed to accumulate this level of debt while maintaining his expensive lifestyle. $2 million, he says, and the way his voice cracks on the number tells me that this isn't just about gambling anymore, that he's crossed some line from recreational risk taking into the kind of financial desperation that destroys families and ends lives. $2 million. If he only knew that I could write him a check for that amount without even noticing the impact on my accounts, that I carry more than that in cryptocurrency in my phone wallet, that his impossible debt represents less than what I make in passive income during a typical morning. But instead of offering to solve his problem, instead of enabling his destructive behavior one more time, I make a different choice. I'm going to let Marcus tell me exactly how deep his betrayal goes before I decide whether he deserves salvation or justice. That's a significant amount of money, I say, and I'm curious about how this situation developed. Because the last time we talked, you said your business was just experiencing temporary cash flow problems. His laugh is bitter and completely devoid of humor. My business? Soph, there never was a business. There was never a product. There was never even a real plan. I've been using investor meetings to launder money from poker games and sports betting, and when the guy funding my fake company finally wanted to see actual results, everything fell apart. The confession is more comprehensive than I was expecting, because Marcus doesn't just admit to lying about his business. He admits to using my reputation as collateral, to forging my signature on documents that made me a guarantor for his gambling debts, to systematically exploiting our family relationship for financial gain. I put your name on some of the loan applications, he continues, his voice getting smaller and more desperate with each word. Told them you were good for the money if anything went wrong. Used your consulting business as proof that our family had stable income and legitimate assets. My consulting business, the small, public-facing company I use as a cover for my real activities, the modest operation that my family believes represents my entire income. He's been telling criminals that I'm worth millions of dollars while believing that I'm barely middle class, creating a situation where my safety depends on my ability to pay debts I never agreed to incur. Marcus, I say, my voice very quiet and very careful, are you telling me that you used my name and reputation as collateral for gambling debts without my knowledge or consent? I never thought it would come to this, he says, and there's something almost touching about his assumption that I'll forgive him for identity theft and fraud because he never meant for things to go this far, as if his intentions somehow matter more than the consequences of his actions. But it has come to this, I reply, and now I need to understand exactly what kind of danger you've created for both of us. Who are these people, Marcus? What kind of timeline are we dealing with? And what specifically do they expect from me? The details he provides over the next hour are both more and less horrifying than I anticipated. More horrifying because the level of his betrayal goes far beyond simple financial exploitation into identity theft and fraud that could have landed me in prison if his scheme had been discovered by law enforcement. And less horrifying because the criminals he's borrowed from are actually sophisticated business people who are more interested in getting their money back than in violence for its own sake. They want to meet with you, he finally admits. Want to verify that you're good for the money and discuss repayment terms. I told them you're a successful businesswoman with substantial assets, and they want to see proof before they agree to extend the deadline. Proof of substantial assets. If Marcus only knew that I could buy and sell his creditor's entire operation without affecting my quarterly budget, that the proof they're demanding would reveal a level of wealth that would transform this entire situation from a family crisis into a business negotiation. Marcus, I say, standing up and moving to my desk where I keep the recording equipment I've been using to document my family's financial manipulation. I want you to understand that what you've done constitutes multiple felonies and that your actions have put both of us in serious legal and physical danger. His face goes completely white as he realizes that I'm not responding with the panic and desperation he was expecting, that I'm treating this situation like a business problem rather than an emotional crisis. But I'm willing to help you resolve this situation, I continue, in exchange for something I need from you: complete honesty about your relationship with our family, your real feelings about me, and your knowledge of any other schemes or manipulations that I should be aware of. The recording device on my desk is small and unobtrusive, but Marcus notices it immediately. And the look that crosses his face tells me that he finally understands the kind of conversation we're actually having. You want me to confess, he says. You want me to admit to things that could destroy our family. I want you to tell me the truth, I reply, and then I want you to let me decide what that truth is worth to me. The confession that follows is comprehensive and heartbreaking and absolutely damning, because Marcus doesn't just admit to his own crimes. He provides detailed information about Margaret's embezzlement from my known accounts, about David's investigation into my business activities, about the systematic planning that went into what they believed would be my eventual murder. We knew you had more money than you were showing us, he says, his voice flat and emotionless. Margaret hired a private investigator years ago, found out about some of your shell companies and investment accounts. We've been trying to figure out how to access everything without making you suspicious. The level of betrayal is staggering because they didn't just stumble into the decision to steal from me. They conducted professional surveillance, developed long-term strategies, coordinated their efforts to systematically drain my resources while planning my elimination. The car accident wasn't supposed to happen yet, Marcus continues, and the casual way he discusses my murder makes my blood run cold. But David thought you were getting suspicious, wanted to accelerate the timeline before you had a chance to change your will or move assets out of reach. By the time he finishes talking, I have enough evidence to destroy all of them legally, socially, and financially. Enough proof of their conspiracy to ensure that they spend the rest of their lives dealing with the consequences of their own greed and betrayal. Thank you for being honest with me, Marcus, I say, stopping the recording and saving the file to multiple secure locations. And now I'm going to be honest with you about something you don't know. I write him a check for $2 million, drawn on an account he's never seen before, signed with a name that technically belongs to me but that he doesn't recognize. Your debt is paid, I tell him, but your relationship with me is over. You have 24 hours to leave the state, and if I ever see you again, if you ever contact me again, if you ever use my name in connection with any financial transaction again, I will ensure that the recording we just made finds its way to every relevant law enforcement agency. The check in his hand represents more money than he has ever seen at one time, but his face shows only confusion and growing terror as he begins to understand that his poor, grateful sister might not be the easy victim he thought he was exploiting. Soph, he whispers, who are you really? I'm someone you should never have underestimated, I reply, and I'm someone you're never going to see again. The door closes behind him with a sound like finality, and as I watch him disappear into the night, I realize that I've just taken the most decisive step toward freeing myself from 20 years of systematic exploitation. And tomorrow, I think it's time to show the world exactly who I really am. The Metropolitan Museum's annual charity gala is exactly the kind of high society event where reputations are made and destroyed in the space of a single evening, where old money mingles with new money and everyone performs their wealth and status for an audience of people who matter. And it's the perfect venue for the revelation that will shatter my family's carefully constructed narrative about their poor, grateful stepdaughter who should be thankful for their charity. I've been planning this moment for weeks, working with the museum's development director to arrange my emergence as a major anonymous donor, coordinating with my publicist to ensure that the announcement receives maximum media coverage, timing everything to coincide with Margaret and Vivian's attendance at an event they're only able to afford because I've been subsidizing their lifestyle for years. The dress I choose costs more than most people's cars. A stunning creation by a designer whose waiting list typically extends for years, but who made an exception when my assistant mentioned that this was for a significant philanthropic announcement. My jewelry comes from my personal collection, pieces I've been acquiring for years but never wearing because I was too afraid that their obvious value would raise questions about my income. Margaret and Vivian arrive early, as they always do at events like this, positioning themselves to network with the kind of established society figures they believe will help them climb the social ladder they've been desperately scaling for decades. They look elegant and expensive, dressed in designer gowns that they charge to credit cards I've been anonymously paying off, wearing jewelry I gave them for Christmas and birthdays, playing the role of successful society matrons with the kind of confidence that comes from never doubting your place in the world. Sophia, Vivian calls out when she spots me across the ballroom, her voice carrying the kind of surprised delight that suggests she never expected her struggling stepsister to be able to afford tickets to such an exclusive event. What a wonderful surprise. I had no idea you were planning to attend tonight. The conversation that follows is masterfully performed. They ask about my dress with the kind of careful admiration that doesn't quite hide their curiosity. About how I could afford such an obviously expensive piece, they compliment my jewelry while clearly calculating its value. They make small talk about the museum's collection while positioning themselves to be seen with me by the photographers who circulate through events like this, documenting the social elite. You look absolutely stunning, darling, Margaret says, her voice carrying just a hint of the concern she always expresses when I display any sign of financial success. I hope you haven't been overextending yourself for special occasions like this. Overextending myself, the subtle suggestion that my appearance tonight represents reckless spending rather than the casual deployment of resources that don't even register as significant expenses in my actual budget. Actually, I reply, my voice calm and confident, in a way that makes both of them pause slightly. I've been much more financially stable lately than I've been in years. My investment portfolio has been performing exceptionally well. Investment portfolio? If they only knew that my portfolio includes holdings in companies they've heard of, real estate they've walked past without knowing I own it, and technology patents that generate more revenue in a month than most people earn in a decade. The evening proceeds exactly as I planned, with Margaret and Vivian networking desperately among the kind of old money society figures they've been trying to impress for years, dropping my name into conversations as they explain their connection to the promising young entrepreneur, who is clearly moving up in the world, positioning themselves to benefit from what they assume is my modest but growing success. The announcement comes during dessert when the museum director takes the stage to thank the evening's major donors and to reveal the identity of an anonymous benefactor who has just pledged $10 million toward the museum's new contemporary art wing. Ladies and gentlemen, the director says, his voice carrying across the ballroom with the kind of authority that makes even the most jaded society figures pay attention. It is my great honor to introduce someone whose generosity and vision will transform this institution for generations to come. Ms. Sophia Chen, founder and CEO of Soft Tech Industries, and one of the most innovative leaders in artificial intelligence development. The silence that follows is profound, because everyone in the ballroom suddenly understands that the modest young woman they've been politely ignoring is actually one of the most powerful people in the room, and the spotlight that finds me at my table illuminates not just my face, but the complete transformation of my social status from charity case to major philanthropist. I stand to acknowledge the applause, and as the cameras flash around me, I can see Margaret and Vivian's faces in my peripheral vision. Shock, confusion, and growing horror as they realize that their poor, struggling stepdaughter has just been revealed as a major tech executive and multi-millionaire donor. The speech I give is brief and professional, thanking the museum for its commitment to innovation and education, discussing my passion for supporting institutions that make art and culture accessible to diverse communities, and mentioning my hope that this gift will inspire other young entrepreneurs to invest in the future they want to see. But the real moment of triumph comes during the reception afterward, when society reporters and other donors approach me to discuss my work and my philanthropic interests, treating me with the kind of respect and deference that my family has never shown me. While Margaret and Vivian hover at the edges of conversations they can no longer participate in as equals. Miss Chen, one of the society photographers, says, approaching our table with the kind of professional enthusiasm that suggests he senses a story. Could I get a photo of you with your family? I understand they must be very proud of your success. The question hangs in the air like a challenge, and I can see Margaret's face cycling through confusion, panic, and desperate calculation as she tries to figure out how to position herself in this new narrative where her stepdaughter is revealed to be more successful and wealthy than she ever imagined. Of course, I reply, my voice carrying just enough warmth to sound gracious while maintaining the professional distance that signals my complete emotional detachment from these people. Margaret and Vivian have always been very supportive of my career ambitions. The photograph that results captures everything perfectly. Me, confident and radiant in my designer gown, standing between two women whose expressions reveal a complex mixture of shock, greed, and growing understanding that their entire relationship with me has been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who has the power in our family dynamic. The society pages the next morning feature that photograph prominently, with a caption that reads, Tech CEO Sophia Chen announces major philanthropic gift with family members Margaret and Vivian Chen Morrison, who express pride in her achievements despite their obvious surprise at the extent of her success. The online comments are merciless because society watchers are experts at reading subtext, and everyone can see that the two older women in the photograph look less like proud family members and more like people who have just realized they've been systematically underestimating someone for years. Did they not know she was successful? One commenter asks. The look on their faces suggests they had no idea their family member was worth millions. Gold diggers exposed, writes another. You can actually see the moment they realize they've been playing the wrong game this whole time. The damage to their social reputation is immediate and irreversible, because in the world they've been desperately trying to enter, nothing is more damaging than being revealed as social climbers who don't even know the true status of their own family members. But the real satisfaction comes from watching them try to manage the cognitive dissonance of learning that their charity case stepsister is actually more successful than they ever dreamed of being, that their financial manipulation schemes were targeting someone who could have bought and sold them without noticing the expense, that their condescending advice about money management was being offered to someone whose investment expertise far exceeds their understanding. The final insult comes when Vivian approaches me at the end of the evening, her voice bright with fake excitement as she tries to rewrite 20 years of history in real time. Sophia, darling, we always knew you were destined for great things. We're so proud of everything you've accomplished, and we can't wait to celebrate your success as a family. But this time, instead of feeling grateful for her approval, instead of apologizing for not sharing my success with them sooner, I look directly into Vivian's eyes and see her exactly as she is. Not the loving sister who supported my dreams, but a desperate social climber who is frantically trying to position herself to benefit from wealth she never knew existed. Thank you, Vivian, I reply, my voice polite and distant. But I think you'll find that my success speaks for itself, and I won't be needing family validation or celebration to feel proud of what I've accomplished. The look that crosses her face is brief but unmistakable. Pure rage, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough for me to miss the flash of fury that comes from realizing that her poor, grateful stepsister is never going to be grateful again. The investigation into Margaret's medical spa begins 3 days after the charity gala, triggered by an anonymous tip to the state medical board about potential licensing violations and financial irregularities. And while I'm not officially responsible for initiating the inquiry, I may have ensured that the investigators have access to certain financial records that reveal the true scope of her illegal activities. The medical spa that Margaret has been running for the past 5 years turns out to be a masterclass in regulatory violation, from unlicensed practitioners performing procedures that require medical supervision, to equipment that hasn't been properly maintained or inspected, to a client list that includes several prominent society figures who are about to discover that their cosmetic treatments were administered by people with no legal authority to provide medical services. But the financial crimes are even more extensive than the medical violations because Margaret's books reveal years of embezzlement from my known accounts, systematic overcharging of clients who trusted her reputation, and insurance fraud schemes that involved billing for procedures that were never performed and treatments that were medically unnecessary. The beauty of the investigation is that I don't have to do anything except provide documentation when requested. Bank records that show the systematic drainage of my accounts, emails that reveal Margaret's manipulation tactics, recorded conversations that demonstrate her consciousness of guilt when discussing her management of my financial affairs. Margaret's first call comes at 6 in the morning, her voice tight with panic as she tries to understand how her carefully constructed world is falling apart so quickly. Sophia, darling, I need to talk to you about some legal issues that have come up with the spa, and I think there may have been some misunderstandings about our family financial arrangements. Misunderstandings, the word she uses to describe years of systematic theft, as if her embezzlement from my accounts was somehow the result of confusion rather than calculated criminal behavior. Of course, Margaret, I reply, my voice calm and professional. Even as I'm recording every word of our conversation, I'd be happy to clarify any questions about our financial relationship. The meeting she requests takes place in her lawyer's office, a desperate attempt to create a formal setting where she can control the narrative about her actions. But the moment I walk into that conference room, I can see from her face that she already knows her situation is hopeless. Sophia, she begins, her voice carrying the same manipulative warmth she's used on me for 20 years. I want you to know that everything I've done has been for the benefit of our family, and I hope you can understand that my management of your resources was motivated by genuine concern for your well-being. Management of my resources, the euphemism she uses for theft, the careful language designed to make her crimes sound like maternal care rather than financial exploitation. Her lawyer, a nervous man who clearly wishes he was handling a different case, presents me with documents that are supposed to represent a settlement agreement regarding the disputed financial arrangements between Margaret and me, but the papers are essentially a confession of guilt disguised as a business negotiation. Mrs. Chen Morrison is prepared to acknowledge that there may have been some irregularities in her handling of Miss Chen's accounts, the lawyer says, his voice carefully neutral as he tries to minimize the legal exposure his client faces. And she's willing to discuss restitution arrangements that would resolve this matter without the need for criminal prosecution. Restitution arrangements. If Margaret only knew that the amount she's stolen from my known accounts represents less than I spend on coffee in a typical month, that her crimes are significant to her but barely register as inconveniences in my actual financial situation. But instead of revealing the true scope of my wealth, instead of explaining that her embezzlement schemes targeted the wrong accounts entirely, I make a different strategic choice. I'm going to let Margaret hang herself with her own desperate attempts at manipulation. I appreciate your desire to resolve this matter amicably, I say, settling into the chair across from her with the kind of calm confidence that makes her lawyer nervous and Margaret absolutely terrified. But I think it's important for everyone to understand exactly what we're discussing here. The documents I produce from my briefcase contain comprehensive records of Margaret's crimes, bank statements showing systematic transfers from my accounts to hers, emails discussing her management of my resources, recorded conversations where she admits to taking money without my permission, and financial records that reveal the true scope of her embezzlement over the past 5 years. Sophia, Margaret says, her voice getting smaller and more desperate as she realizes that I've been documenting her crimes far more thoroughly than she ever imagined. I never meant for any of this to hurt you. I was just trying to help manage your finances during difficult periods. Difficult periods, if she only knew that the difficult periods she's referring to were entirely fictional, that my business troubles were carefully staged performances designed to test her loyalty and reveal her true motivations. Margaret, I reply, my voice quiet and very serious. I need you to understand that what you've done isn't family financial management. It's systematic theft from someone who trusted you with access to their personal accounts. The confession that follows is comprehensive and heartbreaking because Margaret doesn't just admit to embezzling from my known accounts. She provides detailed information about her gambling addiction, about the medical spa's illegal operations, about her investigation into my business activities and her long-term plans for accessing what she believed was my hidden wealth. I hired private investigators to research your business activities, she admits, her voice flat and emotionless. And when we discovered that you had significant assets beyond what you were showing the family, I started making plans to ensure that those resources would eventually benefit everyone. Plans to ensure that those resources would benefit everyone. The euphemism she uses for conspiracy to commit murder, the careful language that describes her intention to kill me and steal everything I'd worked to build. We never wanted to hurt you, she continues. And the way she says this suggests that she genuinely believes her own rationalization, that she's convinced herself that murdering me for my money was somehow an act of family love. We just wanted to make sure that your wealth was used to take care of the people who had taken care of you. The level of self-deception is staggering because Margaret has apparently spent years convincing herself that her financial exploitation was actually a form of maternal protection, that her plans for my elimination were motivated by concern for my well-being rather than greed for my assets. By the time our meeting ends, I have enough evidence to ensure that Margaret spends the rest of her life dealing with the legal consequences of her crimes. And, more importantly, I have the complete truth about how deeply the betrayal extends. The criminal charges come 3 days later: embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, and operating an unlicensed medical facility, and Margaret's arrest makes the evening news because her client list includes several prominent society figures who are now facing their own legal exposure for receiving illegal medical treatments. Her medical license is revoked immediately, her assets are frozen pending criminal trial, and her reputation in the social circles she's spent decades trying to enter is destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery. But the most satisfying moment comes when she calls me from jail, her voice broken and desperate as she makes one final attempt at emotional manipulation. Sophia, please, we're family. You can't let them destroy me over what was essentially a misunderstanding about money. Margaret, I reply, my voice calm and final. You're absolutely right that money was involved in this situation, but you're wrong about whose money it was, and you're wrong about our relationship. The silence that follows is profound because Margaret is finally beginning to understand that her poor, grateful stepdaughter was never the easy victim she appeared to be. We were never family, I continue. You were never my mother, and I was never your daughter. I was your retirement plan, and you were my greatest teacher about the difference between love and manipulation. The phone call ends with her sobbing, and as I hang up, I realize that I've finally freed myself from 20 years of guilt and gratitude and misplaced loyalty to people who never deserved any of those emotions. The Forbes magazine cover story that publishes 6 weeks after Margaret's arrest features a photograph of me in my executive office, surrounded by the kind of technology and luxury that makes it clear exactly who I am and what I've accomplished, with a headline that reads, "The Secret Billionaire, How Sophia Chen Built a $50 billion Empire While Her Family Thought She Was Broke." The article is comprehensive and devastating because the journalist I chose to tell my story is someone who specializes in exposing financial manipulation and family exploitation. Someone who understands exactly how to frame my narrative to maximize the impact on everyone who underestimated me. For 7 years, the article begins, Sophia Chen lived a double life that would make fictional spies envious. By day, she was the struggling entrepreneur her adoptive family saw as their charity case. And by night, she was building one of the most successful technology empires in modern history, all while hiding her achievements from people who were systematically stealing from her modest known accounts. The details that follow are carefully chosen to reveal the scope of my success, while highlighting the irony of my family's manipulation. Softech Industries, valued at $28 billion and revolutionizing medical diagnostics through artificial intelligence. Phoenix Properties, controlling $15 billion worth of luxury real estate in major cities. Chen Ventures, responsible for backing 37 successful startups, including 3 that went on to become unicorn companies. The human interest angle focuses on the systematic betrayal I endured while building this empire. The way my adoptive family used emotional manipulation to drain resources they thought represented my entire net worth, never realizing that their poor, grateful stepdaughter could have bought them anything they wanted if they had simply loved her without agenda. The most tragic aspect of Miss Chen's story, the article continues, is not that her family attempted to exploit her financially. It's that their greed prevented them from recognizing that genuine family love would have provided them with far more than their manipulation ever could have achieved. The photograph that accompanies the article shows me in my penthouse office, wearing a designer suit that costs more than most people's cars, standing next to a window that overlooks a city where I own more property than most real estate investment firms, but the expression on my face is not triumphant. It's profoundly sad because the victory of revealing my success is forever tainted by the knowledge that I had to hide my achievements from people who should have celebrated them. The media response is immediate and overwhelming because my story touches on themes that resonate with anyone who has ever been underestimated, manipulated, or taken for granted by people who claim to love them. Television interviews, podcast appearances, and speaking engagements pour in from organizations that want to hear about my journey from hidden vulnerability to open power. But the most satisfying coverage comes from the society publications that covered the charity gala, because they circle back to analyze the photographs from that evening with new understanding of what they were actually documenting. In retrospect, one society columnist writes, the expressions on Margaret and Vivian Chen Morrison's faces during that museum gala make perfect sense. They weren't looking at their successful stepdaughter with pride. They were looking at her with the horror of people who had just realized they'd been systematically underestimating someone for decades. The online discussions are even more brutal because internet commenters have no patience for people who mistake kindness for weakness or generosity for stupidity. Forum threads dedicated to analyzing my family's behavior generate thousands of comments from people who recognize the manipulation tactics and appreciate the justice of seeing financial predators get exactly what they deserved. She literally could have bought them anything they wanted, one popular comment reads. But instead of just loving her and asking for help, they chose to steal from her and plan her murder. The level of stupidity is actually breathtaking. The business world's response is equally dramatic because venture capital firms and technology companies that had been trying to identify the mysterious founder of soft tech industries suddenly understand that they've been attempting to recruit someone who was already far more successful than most of the people offering her opportunities. Board appointments and advisory positions pour in from companies that want to benefit from my expertise, speaking engagements at economic summits and technology conferences where world leaders seek my advice on artificial intelligence and sustainable development, investment opportunities that could multiply my wealth exponentially if I chose to pursue them. But the most meaningful recognition comes from other entrepreneurs who reach out to share their own stories of family manipulation and financial exploitation. People who understand exactly what it feels like to hide your success from people who would use your achievements against you. Your story gave me the courage to stop apologizing for my success, one email reads, and to start protecting myself from family members who saw my wealth as their entitlement rather than my achievement. The criminal trials that follow provide ongoing entertainment for people who enjoy watching justice served poetically. Margaret facing 15 years in prison for embezzlement and conspiracy. David disbarred and facing his own criminal charges for fraud and identity theft. Marcus fleeing to a country without extradition treaties, but still dealing with the social and financial consequences of his exposure as a gambling addict and family manipulator. Vivian's punishment is perhaps the most elegant, because she's not facing criminal charges, but she's also never going to recover from the social humiliation of being exposed as someone who spent years condescending to a stepsister who was secretly more successful than she could have imagined. Her acting career, which was already struggling, becomes completely impossible when every casting director in the industry knows her as the woman who was too stupid to recognize that her own family member was a billionaire. The final detail that makes the entire situation perfect is the revelation that emerges during Margaret's trial, that my parents' original will had actually designated a different guardian for me, someone who would have loved me without agenda and celebrated my achievements without jealousy, but that Margaret had manipulated the legal system to ensure that she was appointed as my guardian, so that she could access the financial resources she knew were attached to my inheritance. Even my adoption was a financial scam, I tell the Forbes journalist during our final interview, which means that every moment of gratitude I felt toward these people was based on a lie they constructed to facilitate their long-term plan to steal from me. The article ends with a quote that summarizes everything I've learned from this experience. I spent 20 years hiding my light under a bushel because I was afraid that shining too brightly would drive away the only family I had. But it turns out that they were never my family at all. They were just very patient thieves who mistook my kindness for stupidity. Now I know the difference between being valued and being valuable, and I will never hide my power again. Alexander Way finds me 6 months after the Forbes article publishes, not through any of the business networks or society events where wealthy people typically meet their future spouses, but in the coffee shop near my parents' grave where I go every year on the anniversary of their death, sitting quietly with my laptop and working on algorithms that will help doctors diagnose rare diseases in children whose parents can't afford expensive specialists. He approaches my table hesitantly, carrying his own coffee, and wearing the kind of genuinely nervous expression that suggests he's not entirely sure this is a good idea. But something about my solitude in a corner booth has made him decide to take a chance on a conversation with a stranger. "Excuse me," he says, his voice carrying just a hint of an accent that suggests international education and multicultural background. "I don't want to interrupt your work, but I couldn't help noticing that you're coding something that looks like medical diagnostic software, and I'm curious about whether you're working on pediatric applications." The question is so specific and so genuinely interested that I look up from my laptop to study his face, trying to determine whether this is a business approach disguised as casual conversation or simply the kind of coincidental meeting that sometimes happens when two people with similar interests end up in the same place at the same time. I am, actually, I reply, closing my laptop halfway to signal that I'm willing to talk, but not completely certain about his motivations. Diagnostic algorithms for rare genetic conditions that typically require expensive testing and specialist consultations. His smile transforms his entire face from merely handsome to absolutely radiant. And there's something about his enthusiasm for the technical aspects of my work that suggests he understands not just the business implications, but the human impact of what I'm trying to accomplish. That's incredible, he says, settling into the chair across from me with the kind of natural confidence that doesn't need permission, but somehow doesn't feel intrusive. I've been working on sustainable energy applications for remote medical facilities, trying to solve the power infrastructure problems that prevent rural clinics from running diagnostic equipment. The conversation that follows lasts for 4 hours, and by the end of it, I understand that Alexander Wei is the CEO of Wei Sustainable Energy, a company that develops renewable power solutions for underserved communities, that he's the heir to a Hong Kong shipping fortune, but has chosen to focus his career on environmental and social impact rather than profit maximization, and that he's never once asked me about my net worth, my business connections, or my potential value as a strategic partner. What he has asked about is my motivation for developing medical software, my thoughts on technology accessibility in developing countries, my opinion on the ethical implications of artificial intelligence in healthcare, and my experience growing up as an orphan in a system that often fails the children it's supposed to protect. I lost my parents when I was 12, he tells me over our third round of coffee, car accident in Hong Kong, and I spent 6 years living with relatives who saw me primarily as an obligation rather than a person they wanted to love. The parallel to my own experience is so precise that it feels like something out of a romantic novel, but there's nothing performative about his story. Nothing that suggests he's trying to create emotional connection through manufactured similarity. He's simply sharing the truth about his childhood because our conversation has naturally evolved to include personal history along with professional interests. The difference, he continues, is that my relatives were honest about seeing me as a financial burden. So, I never had to waste years trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it. The insight hits me with unexpected force because Alexander has just articulated something I've never been able to express clearly about my own experience. The tragedy wasn't that Margaret and her children never loved me, it was that they convinced me to spend decades trying to earn something they were never going to provide. Our second meeting happens 3 days later when he calls to invite me to dinner at a restaurant I've never heard of, but that turns out to be a small, family-owned place in Chinatown where the food is extraordinary and the atmosphere is completely unpretentious. The kind of establishment where you go for the experience, rather than the social status of being seen there. I should probably mention, he says over appetizers that we're sharing without any awkwardness about who pays for what, that I Googled you after our conversation the other day, and I have to admit I was somewhat intimidated to discover that I was having coffee with one of the most successful tech entrepreneurs in the country. The admission is delivered with the kind of self-deprecating humor that suggests he's not actually intimidated at all, but rather amused by the coincidence of meeting someone whose professional reputation precedes her in most social situations. I was wondering when that was going to come up, I reply, and I have to admit I was enjoying the novelty of talking to someone who was interested in my work rather than my wealth. Well, he says, his smile carrying just a hint of mischief. For what it's worth, sustainable energy development isn't exactly a poverty-stricken field, so I'm probably not the best person to be impressed by your financial success. The conversation that follows reveals that Alexander's company is valued at several $billions, that his family's shipping empire spans 3 continents, and that his personal net worth would qualify him for the same Forbes lists that have been featuring my story. But none of this information feels like a negotiation or a comparison. It's simply context that helps us understand each other's perspectives on wealth, responsibility, and the complicated relationship between money and happiness. The thing about growing up with money after losing your parents, he says over dessert, is that you learn very quickly to distinguish between people who see you as a person and people who see you as an opportunity. The insight resonates with my own experience so perfectly that I find myself sharing details about my family's betrayal that I've never discussed with anyone outside of legal proceedings, talking about the systematic manipulation and financial exploitation that characterized my relationships with the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I spent years hiding my success, I tell him, because I was afraid that if they knew how much I was worth, they would stop pretending to care about me and start openly treating me like a walking bank account. But they were already treating you like a walking bank account, Alexander points out gently. You just didn't realize it because they were better at pretending than you were at recognizing manipulation. The truth of that observation settles around me like relief, because Alexander has just validated something I've been struggling to accept, that my family's betrayal wasn't triggered by my wealth. It was simply revealed by my eventual decision to stop hiding my success. Our relationship develops with the kind of natural progression that feels inevitable rather than forced, built on genuine compatibility rather than strategic advantage, characterized by the kind of mutual respect that can only exist between people who see each other as equals rather than as means to an end. Alexander never asks me for money, never suggests business partnerships that would benefit him more than me, never tries to manage my financial decisions or offer unsolicited advice about investment strategies. Instead, he supports my philanthropic interests, celebrates my professional achievements, and treats my success as something that belongs to me rather than something that should be shared with him simply because we're in a relationship. The proposal comes 18 months after our first meeting, during a private dinner at my penthouse, where we've been working together on a joint project to provide renewable energy and medical diagnostic equipment to rural clinics in developing countries. Sophia Chen, he says, settling onto one knee beside my chair with a ring that's beautiful but not ostentatious, expensive but not wasteful. I've loved you since the day you explained to me how artificial intelligence could save children's lives, and I want to spend the rest of my life building something meaningful with someone who understands that wealth is only valuable when it's used to help other people. The marriage that follows 6 months later is everything my previous engagement wasn't. A celebration of genuine partnership rather than financial merger, attended by people who love us individually rather than people who want to benefit from our combined resources, characterized by the kind of joy that comes from choosing each other freely rather than settling for each other strategically. The wedding photos show two people who are obviously radiantly happy, standing together in a garden that overlooks the city where we both built our empires, surrounded by friends who knew us before we knew each other, wearing expressions that suggest we've found something worth more than all the money in the world. The honeymoon we take is funded by our combined resources, but planned around our shared interests, visiting renewable energy projects in Costa Rica, touring medical facilities in rural Kenya, working with local entrepreneurs who are developing sustainable solutions to problems that governments and large corporations have been ignoring for decades. This is what I always imagined marriage would feel like, I tell Alexander as we watch the sunset from a solar-powered medical clinic we've just helped expand. Like building something together that's bigger than either of us could create alone. The pregnancy announcement comes 2 years later, accompanied by our joint decision to establish a foundation that will focus on supporting orphan children and preventing the kind of financial exploitation I experienced in my own childhood. I want our daughter to grow up in a world where love isn't conditional on financial benefit, Alexander says, his hand resting on my growing belly as we review the foundation's charter documents. And I want her to understand that wealth is a tool for helping others rather than a weapon for controlling them. The nursery we prepare is beautiful but not extravagant, filled with books about science and art and social justice, decorated with photographs from our travels to places where we've helped build schools and clinics and sustainable energy systems, designed to raise a child who understands that privilege comes with responsibility rather than entitlement. As I sit in the rocking chair where I'll soon be reading bedtime stories to my daughter, looking out the window at a city where I own more property than most real estate investment firms, I realize that I've finally learned the difference between being valued and being valuable. I stopped hiding my light under a bushel. I stopped apologizing for my success. I stopped feeling guilty for having more than other people think I deserve. And in return, I found something my family's manipulation never could have provided: a relationship built on genuine love rather than financial opportunity, a partnership based on mutual respect rather than emotional exploitation, a future that belongs to us rather than to people who see our achievements as their inheritance. The final entry in my journal, written the night before my daughter's birth, reads simply: I spent 20 years trying to earn love from people who saw me as a financial resource rather than a human being. But it turns out that the love worth having was always available. I just had to stop hiding who I really was and start believing that I deserved to be loved for myself rather than for what I could provide for others. Margaret Chen Morrison died in prison 3 months before my daughter was born, her medical spa fraud conviction having been compounded by additional charges related to tax evasion and money laundering. Vivian moved to a small town in Montana where she works at a local theater and has apparently found peace in obscurity. Marcus never returned to the United States, but according to my private investigators, he's living modestly in the Philippines and has reportedly overcome his gambling addiction. David Park was disbarred and served 2 years in minimum security prison for fraud, and according to social media, he now works as a paralegal for a firm that specializes in divorce law, which seems like poetic justice given his expertise in manipulating people who trust him with their financial security. But I don't think about any of them anymore because my life now is filled with people who love me without agenda, who celebrate my success without jealousy, who understand that genuine family relationships are built on affection and respect rather than financial dependence. As Alexander and I hold our newborn daughter in the hospital room, where she's just entered the world surrounded by friends who knew us both before we became wealthy and loved us anyway, I realize that I've finally built the family I always wanted. People who see my wealth as a bonus rather than the main attraction, who value my character more than my assets, who love me enough to want me to shine as brightly as possible rather than dimming my light to make them feel better about themselves. I stopped hiding my wealth, and in return, I discovered something infinitely more valuable: the kind of love that doesn't need to be bought, earned, or hidden to be genuine.